In the spring of 1908, a rancher named Amos Crail rode up to a fresh landslide on the ridge above Prickly Pear Creek, Montana, and found a doorway cut into the granite. He had expected a bear den. What he found instead was a corridor with walls, so even they threw his lantern flame back at him like wet slate. Though the stone underfoot was bone dry, there were no pick marks in that rock, no drill holes, no blast fractures radiating from a charge hole, the kind a mining crew leaves behind. The passage had been finished, smoothed, dressed, and closed off, long before the mountain split open to show anyone it was there. The slide had come without warning. 3 days of warm rain let go of a heavy late-season snowpack and stripped nearly 400 feet of loose rock and root mat from the mountain's eastern face. When the dust and runoff settled, the benches below held something that had not been there a week earlier, a dark opening, shoulder high, running back into the mountain farther than a lantern could throw its light. Crail rode back down before dark and told only his brother. The story could have ended there. It didn't. That ridge sits at the northern edge of the same mineral belt that made Butte famous as the richest hill on earth. Its copper fed the smelters of the Anaconda Copper Mining Company. It financed the fortune that Marcus Daly and William Clark spent 20 years fighting over in what the local papers called the War of the Copper Kings. By 1908, prospectors were still fanning out across every drainage within 50 miles of Butte. Prickly Pear Creek had already been picked over twice for gold, once, unsuccessfully, for silver. And every earlier survey of that ridge had logged nothing more than ordinary granite. That is exactly what matters to an archivist reading the records back. A man who had spent 9 seasons finding nothing unusual in that rock was not, by temperament or training, inclined to overstate the one time he did. But there was something else on a shelf inside the corridor, a hammered copper disc about the size of a silver dollar, thin, slightly domed, pierced once near the edge, as though it had been strung. Around its circumference ran a row of small dots described as deliberate rather than accidental wear. Copper of that cold-hammered kind is associated with almost one thing only, the ancient trade networks radiating out of the copper deposits of Lake Superior. The tradition archaeologists now call the Old Copper Complex. A piece of Great Lakes copper, sealed inside a Montana granite passage, meant that Disk had been born 1,000 miles to the east, and years later, a Hopi migration account recorded hundreds of miles to the south would describe the same shape, a finished sealed doorway in solid rock. Nobody ever set the two records side by side. The county assessor mentioned the opening to a state geologist passing through Helena 3 weeks later. The geologist's name was Edward Lansing. That season he was a field surveyor attached to the Montana School of Mines in Butte, logging claims for a mineral survey that had nothing to do with Crail's Ridge. For 9 years he had run traverses across the vast body of granite underlying the district between Butte and Helena. He knew that rock. He knew what an ordinary cave, a fissure, or a blown-out adit looked like from 100 paces. Still, the assessor's description matched nothing in his own field notes, so he gave in to curiosity and rode out. Lansing reached the slide site on the 11th of June 1908. He spent 2 full days inside the passage. He carried a carbide lamp, a plumb line, a steel tape, and a notebook that would travel much further than he expected. His measurements describe a corridor 11 feet wide and just under 7 feet tall for its first 60 feet. Then it narrows, gradually, into a crawl space that continued past the point his lamp oil allowed him to follow. At the narrowing he noted a steady draft of cooler air moving outward, the kind of movement that usually means a much larger connected void somewhere beyond. He wrote that he meant to return with more carbide and a longer rope. His employer's survey schedule never allowed it. The walls, he wrote, were dressed in a manner he could not attribute to any documented technique, ground to a finish more even than a hand chisel produces, without the parallel striations a metal tool leaves behind. There was no soot on the ceiling, which told him no fire had been burned inside for light within living memory. There was no rockfall on the floor, which told him the passage had been sealed, not buried by chance. Lansing's notebook holds 3 pages of sketches instead of the usual single claim diagram, the kind of attention he otherwise reserved for genuine ore bodies. One sketch shows a shallow alcove cut into the north wall, waist height with a smoothed lip along its front edge. He compared it not to a shelf, but to the sill of a window. Another marks 2 shallower niches further back, spaced with what he called a regularity that felt deliberate rather than structural. The floor ran nearly level for its full length. He underlined that twice, because natural cavities and most hand-dug adits follow whatever slope water and gravity have already carved. Lansing exposed 6 glass plates before his light gave out. Those plates, packed with his field kit, went to the School of Mines, and according to the school's own accession records were transferred to a regional collecting institution during a cataloguing consolidation in the 1920s. No institution contacted in recent years has been able to locate them. He wrapped the copper disc in a handkerchief, packed his notebook and plates, and rode the 2 days back to Butte to write his report. When the reply from Washington came some 2 months later, it was not from a geologist. It came from a clerk in the Division of Mineral Resources named Silas Reeve. In 3 brief sentences, Reeve informed Lansing that the passage had been reclassified as a natural solution cavity, the kind limestone produces when groundwater dissolves it slowly over thousands of years. The reclassification ignored one plain fact. The ridge above Prickly Pear Creek is granite. It does not dissolve the way limestone does. Lansing raised the point in a second letter that survives today in the Montana School of Mines archive. He received no reply. Long before this ground belonged to any mining claim, it belonged to people who moved through these mountains on a seasonal round. But that row of dots on the disc pointed to something that carried the record much further south. In those same decades, on the mesas of Arizona, a fieldworker named Francis Aldous, working for the Bureau of American Ethnology, was collecting the migration accounts of the Hopi clans. These were not fairy tales. Hopi tradition holds that before the clans settled on the mesas, their ancestors crossed the continent from one edge to the other, their migrations marked by spiral figures carved into rock, each clan following its own path. Aldous filled several notebooks with accounts a white field worker was never expected to understand the weight of. One account an elder gave her, she identified him only by the initials she used in her own index, describes a clan that had travelled as far as the cold mountains to the north. There, she wrote, that clan had come upon doors finished in the rock. Doors used briefly, then closed again by the same hands that had opened them. A second, shorter account in the same notebook repeats the tradition through the journey of another clan, and adds a detail Lansing's own notes, neither party ever knowing the other, would later echo. One of those doors breathed. Even on warm days, cool air moved out of it. Aldous, unsure of her own accuracy, translated a phrase the elder had used as something closer to the keepers of the doors, not their builders. A distinction she did not claim to understand and did not try to interpret. Aldous filed all 3 accounts under legend, the same heading she used for stories of giants and lake monsters, and there they stayed for more than a century. Lansing's notebook and Aldous' index were never cross-referenced by anyone in either of their lifetimes. One had measured a granite corridor in Montana, the other had recorded a migration route in Arizona. Both described the same finished doorway. Neither knew the other existed. It was not the corridor that made the coincidence hard to dismiss. It was the disk. The old copper complex ran for thousands of years. It is documented as far south as the Ohio Valley, as far east as the Atlantic seaboard. West of the Dakotas, it is rarely confirmed at all. A single worked disk recovered from a sealed passage in central Montana would mark one of the westernmost points that Trade Network has ever been shown to reach. And that row of dots along the disk's edge carries a resemblance, noted only in passing, by a museum researcher decades after Lansing's report. A resemblance to a design element that appears independently on the borders of woven and painted work collected from southwestern communities in those same decades. A border of evenly spaced points. Whether that resemblance reflects a real thread of design memory reaching back to whoever made the disc, or nothing more than the fact that evenly spaced dots are a simple pattern likely to recur on their own, has never been formally investigated. It can't be. The disc itself has never been available for the side-by-side comparison that would settle it. Archaeologists working the Northern Rockies have documented extensive indigenous stonework across the region, quarry sites, chipped points, groundstone tools for processing routes, but almost nothing resembling a deliberately ground and polished corridor of the kind Lansing described. That absence cuts two ways. It could mean the passage was never made by anyone at all, that Lansing, in the excitement of an unusual find, overstated an ordinary fracture. Or it could mean the technique that produced that finish belongs to a period, a people, or a purpose the region's archaeological record has never once been asked to account for. Because no professional excavation has ever tested the site against either possibility. Lansing was not the only surveyor to ask questions about that ridge. In the spring of 1911, an independent mining engineer named Corliss Bede, working a claim 2 miles upstream, filed his own brief note with the same Helena office. He described what he called an artificial gallery exposed by erosion in the same formation, apparently with no knowledge of Lansing's earlier report. Bede's note drew the same response, word for word, in 2 of its 3 sentences, as if the same clerk or the same standard letter had simply been reused. Within 2 years, Bede left mining entirely, moved to Spokane, and took up surveying for the railroads. A short obituary years later, among a long list of his accomplishments, mentions that he had once found an unusual rock feature in Montana that the government told him was nothing. No further explanation, and no knowledge that another surveyor, 2 miles away, had been told the same thing in nearly the same words 3 years earlier about the same mountain. A rancher's deposition, a geologist's shelved field notes, 4 sentences on the inside page of a newspaper, and a Hopi migration account hundreds of miles to the south. All of them described the same finished passage, the same sealed door, and not one of the people who recorded it had ever spoken to another or known the others existed. The copper disc took a different path. In the winter of 1908, before the reclassification letter was even drafted, it was forwarded from the Butte office to the Smithsonian Institution's Division of Anthropology. It was catalogued under a general accession number issued for a batch of Montana copper artifacts collected that year from several unrelated sources, and according to the accession ledger that still exists, it was never assigned to any published study or exhibit. Decades later, an internal memorandum turned up in the museum's own administrative files, dated 1937, signed only with the initials of a junior curator. It flags the Montana lot as worth closer study for what it calls its anomalous western provenance relative to known old copper complex distribution, and recommends the item be pulled for comparison against the museum's Wisconsin and Michigan holdings. There is no record the analysis was ever carried out. The memo was filed rather than acted on. A single page in a folder of similar recommendations a 1930s museum staffed far below the size of its collections had no practical way to work through. The curator who wrote it is not identified in any surviving personnel record researchers have located. In the 1980s, a researcher who asked to view the item was told by museum staff that it could not be found in current storage within the time frame of her visit. The passage, like the disc in its drawer, kept surfacing on its own. In 1973, a Forest Service employee surveying grazing allotments noted in his field diary that runoff had partially reopened the slide face again that spring. He photographed the opening out of personal interest rather than official duty, and filed the photos with his allotment paperwork, where they sat unindexed until a records clean-out in the 1990s discarded most of that decade's grazing files. In 1986, a separate company running a routine claim survey just downslope logged the feature too. Finding no ore worth pursuing, it described the thing only as an old adit, unusually finished, not examined further. One line in an appendix of anomalies it had no commercial reason to chase. That report surfaced only because a retired employee later donated his personal copy to the same Montana Historical Society archive. In 2017, a LiDAR survey flown over the drainage for an unrelated wildfire fuel mapping project caught the same rectangular anomaly in its elevation data. One line among hundreds in an appendix, flagged only as possible mine feature, no further action recommended, that no one had any reason to read closely. The official explanation is simple, and it should not be waved away. Skeptics reasonably point out that Lansing may have overstated an ordinary fracture in the excitement of an unusual find. Evenly spaced dots are a simple pattern that recurs on its own, in many traditions, without any shared origin. A single disk could have travelled a long way along known trade routes, with no builder ever standing in the north. And Hopi migration traditions are broad and describe many places. Matching one of them to a single ridge in Montana proves nothing. None of these objections is weak on its own. The landslide is real. The granite is real. The disk, if the ledger is accurate, is real. The unanswered questions begin only after that point. The passage did not stay open long after Lansing left it. In the winter of 1934, a second, smaller slide collapsed the outer face again, and a federal mining bureau ordered the opening sealed with waste rock the following spring, citing safety for the grazing operation below. That sealing order makes no mention of Lansing's report, the reclassification letter, Bede's note, or the copper disc. It treats the passage as a routine hazard, in the same boilerplate applied to any abandoned prospect hole on that mountain. The mountain has been reopened by weather at least twice more since 1934, and each time closed again by men who had never read Lansing's notebook, Aldous' index card, or Bede's note. They could not have known that the ground they were shoveling rock over had been described by 4 separate hands across more than a century as a place finished by someone else, long before any of them arrived. Today, the land above Prickly Pear Creek is a private grazing lease, fenced, quiet, marked on the county plate only as an inactive mineral claim. No formal excavation has ever been conducted there. The disc itself, if the accession ledger is accurate, sits in a drawer somewhere in the Smithsonian's collections. Unphotographed in any published catalogue anyone outside the institution has located. Ground-penetrating radar, or LiDAR at close range, could establish in an afternoon whether the crawl space Lansing's notebook speculated about actually continues. No one has ever come to the family with a concrete plan, a funding source, and a liability arrangement all at once. And a great-grandson of Amos Crail, still ranching in the valley today, says the family used to call that ridge by a name of its own. A name that appears nowhere in Lansing's report, nowhere in Aldous' notebooks, nowhere in any official document. A name whose origin the family itself does not know. The shut door, 4 separate hands, a rancher, a geologist, a newspaper, and a Hopi elder describing the doors to the north, recorded the same sealed passage without ever meeting. Who finished it, and who did the Hopi mean by the keepers of the doors? So leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what do you think happened on that ridge? And subscribe to keep following buried records like this one.